to prevent the importation of Muslim slaves from West Africa to the Americas, precisely for this reason, to keep Islam out of the Americas. The conquest of Granada in the south, the expulsion of Jews from Iberia, and the Atlantic voyages were all a piece of the same power of Christendom for him. If you read sources from the Spanish in the 16th century after their conquest of various parts of the Americas, they're much more interested in the Ottomans than they are in the Americas. That's clear. In trade alone, right? There are many European trading companies and individual merchants who are doing business in the Ottomans.
Welcome to Unraveling the Middle East. I'm Adel Ali, your host. My guest for this deep dive into history is Dr. Mikhail, a professor of history and chair of the Department of History at Yale University. He has received many awards for his scholarship and publications in the fields of Middle Eastern and environmental histories. I've dropped a link below so you can learn more about his many books, extensive research, and distinguished career. So please join me and Dr. Mikhail as we unravel the Middle East. Dr. Mikhail, we touched on this question that I'm about to ask you in our prior segment. What I want to know, and we'll get into more detail now, what I want to know is, did Europeans think of the Ottomans mainly as a military power? For example, the Mongols were a military power, right? Or did they also look into the Ottomans' culture, science, governing system, living standards?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the kind of military confrontations between various Christian powers and the Ottomans, but no doubt, I mean, there are plenty of very cooperative, copacetic instances of relationship between, European and European powers and the Ottomans. If we think in trade alone, right? There are many European trading companies and individual merchants who are doing business in the Ottoman Empire, whether they're from Italy or the Levant Company, for example, or other parts of Europe doing business. Because of the lucrative markets of the Ottoman Empire, the access to trade with points further east, right? Many of the Silk Road routes have their terminus.
And this continues after the opening of the Atlantic world.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, it's not at all clear, and I think a lot of people are not really aware of this. It's not at all clear for European powers until maybe the 17th century or even the 18th century that the Americas is really the future of the world, right? In the sense
that
of
long, interesting,
of lucrative markets and whatnot. If you read, sources from the Spanish in the 16th century after their conquest of various parts of the Americas, they're much more interested in the Ottomans than they are in the Americas. That's clear.
Even after they go to the Americas, that's interesting.
Even after,
yeah.
I mean, famously, the English trade with North Africa for sugar, for example. These are very lucrative and, I want to say cooperative, but relationships that work quite well or that are mutually beneficial for both sides, let's say. If we think about things like the history of science, for example, right? There's clear exchange between European thinkers and Muslim thinkers that's going on in this period. So there's a lot of exchange between, if you like, both sides of the Mediterranean, right? And this is something that historians have spent a lot of time in recent years thinking about, are the exchanges across these cultural religious divides, and that these divides are perhaps not so important as we make them out to be.
Interesting. In your research, did you come across any suggestions, indications that early on in Ottoman history, let's say the 16th century and early 17th century. Was there any signs of envy from the Europeans with one specific on one specific subject, sort of living standards, coming to Constantinople or perhaps other cities and saying, "Wow, no."
No, I mean, there is certainly that. I mean, there are various European travelers who are very impressed with, the water systems of Istanbul, for example, or just the size of these cities, right? Istanbul is, 5 times the size of Paris in the 16th century. The cities in the Middle East are something that travelers often comment on, European travelers. Or the foods, for example, right?
Why the foods, they're different or they're just better?
Yeah, no, the variety of foods that are available, right? I mean, the dress of people in cities, right? I mean, European travelers are there is a kind of anthropological gaze in various travel accounts about places in the Ottoman Empire.
Interesting. So why did you say no when I asked you this question, whether or not they were envious?
I think that was just me having a verbal tick. I don't think I shut down your question.
I see. Another point that I've read through my own research, if you will, over the years is that, and I don't know if the scholars that have said this are European or what, that the Ottomans, especially in the early decades, owe much of their success to the systems created by the Byzantine Empire, and that's not so unusual to say. That you could say, like, the Abbasids, that became the second major empire of Islam, owe much of their success to the systems created by the Sasanian Persians, for example. I've heard that said too. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big debate amongst historians. Some say the Ottomans were successful because they adopted Byzantine practices. Some say they were successful because of Islam. Some say they were successful because they were Turks. Every empire absorbs what existed before,
of course,
and uses some of it and adapts some of it. Right.
Yeah.
So it's that idea that it's a one-way extraction from Byzantine rule into Ottoman rule, I think, is too crude and too simplistic a story, right?
Yeah.
Ottoman success is a much more complicated story than simply that they were just doing what the Byzantines did.
Exactly. So you're not moved by that argument. We're on the same page. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Mikhail as we get into the perspective. After 20 years of being in power, last year Mr. Erdoğan again ran for Turkey's highest office. Back then, we produced an episode with Dr. Sinan Ciddi, who explained how Atatürk and Erdoğan transformed Turkey to essentially reflect their own life experiences. As Dr. Ciddi tells this history, from an early age, Atatürk resented religion, and more than that, he despised Islam. But Erdoğan grew up resenting Turkey's secularization and Western credentials, and he campaigned on a message of taking back Turkey to its golden age of the Ottoman Empire. I've dropped a link for you to my conversation with Dr. Ciddi. Now, let's get back to our conversation with Dr. Mikhail. Dr. Mikhail, what is the impact of Sultan Selim on our time?
Yeah. So to answer that question, we really have to think about the impact of, the Ottoman Empire in this moment, right? Mm-hmm. Again, 1470 to 1520. And the ways in which the Ottomans were inserted, if you like, or impacted or had an influence on some of the world-changing events of that moment. So we've already sort of discussed the Atlantic conquests. We mentioned the Reformation. In the book, I have a chapter on the ways that Luther thought about Islam and, some of the ways in which Islam figured into his thinking. So, we're not used to understanding Islam as having a place after, I don't know, pick a year, 1600, 1500. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of that has to do with the opening of the Atlantic world and looking west and the quote unquote rise of Europe, as opposed to a medieval world in which the Ottomans and other Muslim powers, we might say, were in the ascendancy, right? After 1453, the Ottomans are a major power in the Mediterranean, but then, you know, it only lasts for 100 years because the Atlantic is where the future is, and that's really a European conquered domain, right? Mm-hmm. In part, we're kind of following the lead of those European colonists and their patrons and the historians who wrote their histories by saying that, you know, the Americas is an Islamless world, right? That Muslims have no place in the Atlantic world. There are no Muslims in the Americas, right? In the first 50 years of European colonization in the Americas, there's a lot of correspondence back and forth between the Spanish crown and various authorities in the Americas to prevent the importation of Muslim slaves from West Africa to the Americas, precisely for this reason, to keep Islam out of the Americas, right?
Oh, wow. And I take it that's not just for a religious person. That has to do with politics, geopolitics.
Yes. I mean, it has to do with the kind of story of confessionalization we were talking about before, right?
Yeah. In the previous segment.
The trouble of Islam in the old world for Christendom should be kept out of this new place, right? This says nothing about indigenous communities, of course. But for the Europeans, you know, Islam is still the kind of major specter of fear that it had been for a couple centuries at this point. So part of the work of the book is to try to show how Islam actually has a role to play, and the Ottomans have a role to play in all of these stories that we tell ourselves about world history. And the Atlantic piece is just one part of that story. And so I want readers to come away with the book thinking that, you know what, 1492 does not erase the previous 1,000 years of history, and that some of what happened in the Mediterranean is crucial for understanding what will happen in the Atlantic world, and that we have to keep those two things together in the way that Columbus did, for instance, right? The conquest of Granada in the south, the expulsion of Jews from Iberia, and the Atlantic voyages were all a piece of the same power of Christendom for him.
And they all happened in a sort of a very compact
exact same moment.
Yeah.
Within a 6-month period. And we historians have tended to, you know, slice off one of those pieces of the story and analyze them independent from the other. So part of the work of my book is to try to bring those two things back together and to take seriously the idea that someone like Columbus saw his voyages as part of a crusade. And he was very explicit about that. At the end of his life, he is putting together a book of prophecies about the end of the world in which Islam will finally be erased from the earth so that Christendom can carry the day, right? He is interested in raising an army to, in his words, reconquer Jerusalem, right? So these are things that were very serious for our protagonists.
If I may interrupt you for a second, please. So he goes to the Americas in 1492. End of his life comes about a decade or so later. He's writing a book about the Crusades, and the first Crusade happened almost 300 years prior in 1099. This is still very much alive in Europe.
Oh yeah, people are calling for Europeans are calling for crusades into the 18th century. You know, when we say the Crusades, yes, often people mean the medieval Crusades, but Crusades are being called into the early modern period.
Wow,
with less and less seriousness ultimately, but
yeah.
But yes, that's a yeah. So in thinking about, you know, why should we care about this story? That's one of the reasons we should care, right? Is to give us a fuller, more complete, and different sense of the Americas, right? We are, after all, here as the kind of inheritors of this conquest, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to put you on the spot, Dr. Mikhail, for a second and ask you, are there any lessons from Sultan Selim's time for our time? We talked about how he impacted us, but are there any lessons?
Yeah, well, there's the kind of story of impact that I've been talking about, both the Atlantic world. We could talk about the Reformation, which I just mentioned very briefly. Another one that I talk about very briefly in the book is how the unity of the Ottoman Empire allowed for different trade routes to emerge in the empire, eventually to Europe. And I trace this through the story of coffee. But in terms of, lessons that we can take away from the life of Selim, he wasn't a very laudatory or he wasn't a good person, right? He's not someone we should seek to emulate in any kind of way. He was a ruthless, violent, if you like, dictatorial, but it's not a word that really applies in this period, ruler. He did vastly expand the territory of the Ottoman Empire, as we discussed. So I think it's important for post-Ottoman societies, if I can use that term, to understand the role of Ottoman history in their own histories. And this is something that, we mentioned at the beginning, 33 different countries. In different places, the status of the Ottomans in the national myth is very different. Usually, it's suppressed or denigrated or considered to be a negative impact on those societies, right? That it was suppressing the national ethos of Bulgaria or Egypt or Syria.
Or Lebanon or what have you.
Yes. So, I'm not trying to say that the Ottomans were, a wonderful, peace-loving, secular, liberal, wonderful state, but they were important.
Yeah.
And we should take that seriously. We should take that seriously in the Middle East and in parts of Europe where the Ottomans reigned and in Turkey itself. And we should take that seriously in the Americas, in places like Brazil and Florida. And we should take it seriously in the Indian Ocean. The Ottomans truly are a global empire. And I think Selim's period, which is the focus of the book, is why I focused on that period in the book, is the period in which that becomes the case.
One last question. You said in this segment, and you had said this before too, that he's essentially not a good man. He's brutal. He was after conquest. Well, many monarchs were, but when you say he was brutal and he was not a good man, are these your assessment of a scholar, of a person of 21st century? Was he a successful monarch in the eyes of his colleagues and other monarchs around the world? Do you see what I mean? If I may just use colloquial, was he like a badass in his own time, and now you're sort of saying he was a bad man? Are we looking at this?
Look, I'm not interested in value judgments. That's not my place as a historian. You asked me, are there things that we should, lessons we can learn from him and his period? Not from him. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't suggest that people, model themselves on Selim. But yeah, I mean, he was a successful sultan. There's no doubt about that. In some ways, we might say the most successful in that he won his empire more territory than any other sultan in 600 years of Ottoman history. Now, territory is not the only measure of success, for sure, but it's a pretty big one. And I try to say I try to show at the end of the book how some of the innovations that we ascribe to later sultans were impossible without this geographical expanse.
Yeah, yeah.
Suleiman the Magnificent is Selim's son, just to be clear. And a lot of the success that is ascribed to Suleiman is based on the fact of this geographic expanse, right? The reason that he is so present in European diplomatic correspondence, Suleiman, is because the empire is now a gargantuan state ruling the southern Mediterranean coast and all of the eastern Mediterranean. Why is that? It's because of his
Selim
father's
the First.
conquest.
Yeah.
Right. So those are things that we have to take seriously. So sure, he was a very successful monarch in his period. But again, he does rule for a very short amount of time, only 8 years.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not interested in a what could have been kind of story. But I'm interested in telling the very real story of the consequences of his reign and his life.
Yeah. Dr. Mikhail, thank you for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could unravel the Middle East, please share it with us. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.